The mountain man expected a loveless marriage when his black bride stepped down from the dusty stagecoach, clutching a worn leather satchel that would soon reveal secrets no one anticipated. Townspeople whispered he was so desperate for help surviving another brutal winter that he'd advertise for any woman willing to endure his isolation. They assumed she was equally desperate, fleeing east with nowhere else to turn. Both seemed destined for a cold arrangement of mere survival in the unforgiving Wyoming wilderness. But the educated woman carried knowledge that could transform their remote settlement, while harboring a dangerous past that threatened to destroy everything. A powerful man from her former life would soon arrive, bringing not just personal vengeance, but a scheme to seize their entire community's land through legal manipulation. When her secret unfolds, will their fragile new bond become their salvation or lead to the destruction of everyone they've grown to protect? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. Jeremiah Cole pressed his back against the cabin wall as another gust of mountain wind rattled the loose boards. Ice crystals formed on the inside of his windows. His last can of beans sat empty on the table beside a cold fireplace he could barely keep lit. The fever had taken his wife Sarah 3 winters ago. Since then, he'd lived like a ghost, haunting his own life, trapping, hunting, avoiding the settlement below. But this winter nearly killed him. For 2 days he'd lain delirious with sickness. No one to bring water or tend the fire. He couldn't survive another season alone. The advertisement felt like surrender when he wrote it. Seeking capable woman for mountain partnership. Work required. Romance not expected. He posted it to newspapers in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. A business arrangement. Nothing more. Meanwhile, Grace Washington folded another torn dress in the cramped Philadelphia boarding house room she shared with her sister. Through thin walls came the sound of their elderly landlord demanding next week's rent early. Again, the bakery had been everything to her family. Her father had saved for 15 years to buy the small shop. Her mother's sweet rolls drew customers from across the city. Grace kept the books with mathematical precision learned at Oberlin College. Then came the threats. Broken windows. Spoiled flour. Customers warned away. Their neighbor made it clear that educated colored families weren't welcome in his improving district. The bank refused to extend their loan despite perfect payment history. Grace found Jeremiah's advertisement tucked between job postings for maids and laundresses. Most women would see isolation and hardship. Grace saw possibility, dignity, a chance to use her mind instead of hiding it. Her first letter was careful and honest. She mentioned her education but emphasized practical skills: sewing, cooking, managing household accounts. She didn't mention the medical training that had made her classmates whisper behind her back. Jeremiah's response surprised her. He wrote about books, asked about her thoughts on westward expansion. Their correspondence grew from practical exchanges to genuine conversation. Grace began to hope this mountain man might value her intelligence rather than fear it. The stagecoach journey took 3 weeks. Grace clutched her medical bag and tried to ignore stares from other passengers. A well-dressed merchant made loud comments about people getting too big for their proper place. Grace kept her eyes on the passing landscape and thought about the respectful tone in Jeremiah's letters. Cedar Ridge appeared smaller than she'd imagined. A dozen buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud when it rained. The stagecoach driver dropped her trunk with unnecessary force. Elena Vasquez emerged from the general store. Her kind smile was the first welcoming face Grace had seen in days. "You must be the bride we've heard about." Word traveled fast in small towns. Grace noticed curtains twitching in windows. A group of men outside the saloon stopped talking to stare. Their expressions ranged from curious to hostile. Pastor Williams introduced himself and offered to perform the ceremony immediately. "Best to make things proper right away," he said, glancing toward the watching townspeople. Jeremiah appeared more weathered than Grace had expected. Years of mountain sun and wind had carved deep lines around his eyes, but his handshake was firm and his greeting respectful. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult. I'm grateful to be here." They stood awkwardly in the church while Pastor Williams prepared his Bible. Elena served as witness along with two curious shopkeepers. The ceremony lasted 5 minutes. Walking toward Jeremiah's cabin afterward, Grace heard whispers following them. "Wonder how long she'll last. Mountain living ain't for everyone. Desperate times call for desperate measures." The cabin sat a mile from town, surrounded by pine trees and overlooking a valley that stretched toward distant peaks. Inside, Grace found sparse furniture and walls that needed chinking, but the bones of a good home existed beneath years of neglect. "I know it's not much," Jeremiah said. "I stopped caring about comfort after Sarah died." Grace set down her medical bag. The leather was worn, but well maintained. Jeremiah noticed her careful handling of it. "Are you ill? Do you need medicine?" "I have some medical training. Perhaps I can help if anyone in the settlement gets sick." Jeremiah stared at her. "Medical training? You didn't mention that in your letters." Grace's stomach tightened. She'd hidden her education from too many people who found it threatening. "I studied at Oberlin College. They taught more than most schools allow women to learn." The silence stretched between them. Grace prepared for the familiar reaction: suspicion, resentment, fear of a woman who knew too much. Instead, Jeremiah nodded slowly. "That explains why your letters were so well written. This territory needs people with education." Relief flooded through Grace. Perhaps she'd finally found a place where her mind was welcome. That evening they ate a simple meal of bread and preserved meat. Jeremiah asked about her family and listened without judgment as Grace described the bakery's destruction. When she mentioned her father's pride in buying his own business, Jeremiah's expression softened. A man should be able to keep what he builds through honest work. Grace studied her new husband across the small table. His words carried conviction that made her believe this arrangement might become something real, something good. But tucked in her trunk lay an unopened letter that had arrived the day before her departure. The handwriting on the envelope made her hands shake. "Some threats followed you no matter how far you ran." Grace woke to find frost covering the cabin windows. October in the Wyoming mountains meant winter preparations couldn't wait. She moved through morning chores with quiet efficiency while Jeremiah tended his trap lines. The settlement women watched her with careful eyes during her first trip to the general store. Their conversations paused when she approached. Resumed in whispers after she passed. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house made her opinion clear. "Some folks don't know their place. Education makes people forget where they come from." Grace kept her responses polite and brief. She bought supplies and returned to the cabin without engaging their hostility, but their words stung deeper than she wanted to admit. Elena Vasquez proved different. The Mexican woman faced her own share of cold shoulders from certain townspeople. She offered genuine friendship without judgment. "Small minds make small towns smaller," Elena said while weighing Grace's flower purchase. "Give them time, or better yet, show them what you can do." Grace spent her days transforming Jeremiah's neglected cabin. She chinked gaps in the walls and organized his scattered possessions. Her medical bag remained hidden beneath folded quilts. No point advertising skills that might threaten fragile acceptance. Jeremiah watched her work with growing admiration. She approached every task with methodical intelligence. When she suggested improvements to his food storage system, he listened carefully and implemented her ideas. Their evening conversations became the highlight of both their days. Grace shared stories from her college classes. Jeremiah described the mountain wildlife with surprising eloquence. The formal politeness of their arrangement gradually warmed into genuine companionship. Then came the morning that changed everything. Jeremiah had left early to check distant traps. Grace was hanging laundry when frantic shouting erupted from the main street. She ran toward the commotion and found a crowd gathered outside the saloon. 2 men carried an unconscious trapper between them. Blood soaked through makeshift bandages around his leg. The wound was deep and still bleeding heavily. "Where's Doc Peterson?" someone yelled. "Gone to Denver for supplies. Won't be back for a week." The injured man was Tom Bradley, a quiet trapper who always nodded politely when he saw Grace in town. His face had gone gray from blood loss. Without treatment, he would die within hours. Mrs. Henderson pushed forward. "I've tended wounds before. Bring him to my parlor." Grace watched Mrs. Henderson examine the injury. The older woman's hands shook as she tried to stop the bleeding with inadequate pressure and dirty cloth. Her folk remedies wouldn't save a man with this severe an injury. "The bleeding's too heavy," Mrs. Henderson announced. "Ain't nothing more I can do. Someone should fetch the pastor." Grace stepped forward. Her heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. "I can help him." The crowd turned to stare. Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You're not a doctor." "I have medical training. He needs surgery to repair the damaged artery." "Surgery?" Mrs. Henderson laughed bitterly. "You think folks here are foolish enough to let you practice your book learning on a dying man?" Tom Bradley's breathing grew shallow. Grace could see his pulse weakening. In minutes, it would be too late for any intervention. He'll die without proper treatment. Better to die with dignity than be experimented on. Grace looked around the circle of faces. Some showed curiosity. Others displayed open hostility. None offered support for her intervention. Tom's eyes fluttered open. His gaze found Grace's face. "Please," he whispered. That single word gave Grace the authority she needed. She pushed past Mrs. Henderson and knelt beside the injured man. "Bring me clean water, soap, and the sharpest knife you can find. Someone build up that fire and put a pot of water on to boil." Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions. People began moving to follow her instructions before they consciously decided to trust her. Grace opened her medical bag for the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge. Inside lay surgical instruments that had belonged to Dr. Marcus Webb, her mentor at Oberlin. He'd believed medical knowledge belonged to anyone capable of learning it, regardless of race or gender. She'd assisted him through dozens of similar procedures during the cholera outbreak that swept through Philadelphia's poorest neighborhoods. While other doctors fled to safer districts, Dr. Webb had stayed to treat anyone who needed help. Grace had been his most dedicated student. "I learned surgery from Dr. Marcus Webb," she told the watching crowd while cleaning Tom's wound. "He trained me to handle arterial injuries during the cholera epidemic of '76. Her hands moved with practiced precision. She located the damaged blood vessel and began the delicate work of repair. The crowd watched in fascinated silence as she demonstrated skills none of them had imagined a woman could possess. 30 minutes later, the bleeding stopped. Tom's color began returning to normal. Grace bandaged the repair work and gave detailed instructions for his care during recovery. Mrs. Henderson stared at Grace with newfound respect mixed with obvious resentment. "Where did you really learn to do that?" "Oberlin College Medical Program. I was Dr. Webb's surgical assistant for 2 years. The crowd dispersed slowly, talking among themselves in hushed voices. Grace packed her instruments with hands that barely trembled from the adrenaline. Elena appeared beside her with a cup of coffee. "That was remarkable. You saved his life." Grace accepted the coffee gratefully. "I hope it was enough." Tom Bradley recovered completely. Within days, everyone in Cedar Ridge knew about Grace's medical skills. The whispers changed from suspicious to amazed. People began approaching her with minor injuries and questions about family health. Mrs. Henderson never apologized, but she stopped making pointed comments about people forgetting their place. Jeremiah found Grace that evening reading by lamplight. Pride showed clearly in his expression. Tom told everyone you're the finest doctor he's ever seen. Grace closed her book and smiled. "I'm just glad I could help." For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, she felt like she might truly belong somewhere. Grace's reputation spread beyond Cedar Ridge within weeks. Miners from distant camps arrived seeking treatment for injuries that would have crippled them permanently. She set broken bones with precision that amazed veteran mountain men who'd seen countless field surgeries. Her medical practice grew organically. Jeremiah built shelves in their cabin's front room to hold her expanding collection of herbs and supplies. Grace treated everyone regardless of their ability to pay. Payment came in the form of fresh vegetables, repaired tools, and genuine respect. The transformation in how townspeople viewed her was remarkable. Mrs. Henderson began recommending Grace to visitors who needed medical attention. Even the men who'd initially questioned her presence now tipped their hats when she passed. Grace started teaching basic reading lessons in the church basement. Elena brought her young son Miguel. Two Shoshone women traveled from the reservation to learn English letters alongside their children. Grace's classroom became the most integrated space in the territory. Jeremiah watched his wife's growing influence with pride that surprised him. He'd married her for practical reasons, but found himself falling in love with her brilliant mind and generous spirit. Their evening conversations had evolved into the foundation of genuine partnership. The change in their relationship became evident through small gestures. Grace mended his clothes with care that went beyond duty. Jeremiah brought her wildflowers and books ordered from Denver. They worked together, preparing for winter with the rhythm of a couple building a shared future. Their physical affection grew naturally from mutual respect. Jeremiah's gentle touch when he helped her down from the wagon spoke of love, not obligation. Grace's smile when she bandaged his minor cuts revealed feelings deeper than friendship. November brought the first serious snowfall and Grace's first real test of mountain survival. She approached the challenge with characteristic determination, learning to preserve food and manage heating fuel with mathematical precision. It also brought the letter that shattered her growing sense of security. Grace found the envelope tucked between supply orders at Elena's store. Her name was written in handwriting she recognized with sick dread. Cornelius Whitmore's elegant script hadn't changed since she'd last seen it in Philadelphia. She waited until Jeremiah left to check his trap lines before opening it. The letter was brief and terrifying in its confidence. Whitmore knew where she was. He knew about her marriage. He was coming to bring her home where she belonged. He'd made powerful friends in territorial government who would help him reclaim his property. Grace burned the letter immediately but couldn't erase its message from her mind. She'd thought distance and marriage would protect her from Whitmore's obsession. She'd been wrong. The second letter arrived a week later, delivered by a nervous postal worker who seemed reluctant to hand it over. This time, Whitmore's tone was more threatening. He described her life in Wyoming with details that proved he'd hired someone to watch her. He knew about her medical practice, her teaching, her growing closeness with Jeremiah. Grace began having nightmares about Whitmore arriving in Cedar Ridge. In her dreams, he destroyed everything she'd built with a few words to the right territorial officials. Her marriage could be annulled, her medical practice shut down. The community that had finally accepted her could turn against her if they knew the truth about her past. She considered telling Jeremiah but couldn't find the words. How could she explain that her presence might bring danger to everything he cared about? How could she admit that their marriage had begun as her escape from another man's threats? Elena noticed Grace's growing anxiety during their weekly visits to the store. "You've been quiet lately? Is everything well at home?" Grace forced a smile. "Just tired from the long days." But Elena had faced her own struggles with powerful men who thought they owned other people's futures. She recognized the signs of someone carrying a dangerous secret. December brought a crisis that revealed new depths to Jeremiah's character. Grace fell seriously ill with mountain fever after treating a family of miners who'd contracted the disease. For 3 days, she burned with temperature that left her delirious and weak. Jeremiah never left her side. He applied the herbal remedies his first wife Sarah had taught him during their early years together. Grace had transformed his understanding of healing through her medical knowledge, but he possessed mountain wisdom that proved equally valuable. He brewed teas from willow bark and pine needles. He kept cool cloths on her forehead and forced her to drink water when she wanted only to sleep. His gentle hands and steady presence became her anchor during the worst of the fever. When Grace finally woke clearly on the 4th day, she found Jeremiah asleep in the chair beside their bed. His face showed exhaustion from days of constant care. She realized how much this quiet mountain man had come to mean to her. "You saved my life," she whispered when he woke. "You've saved mine every day since you arrived." Their relationship crossed a threshold that night. What had begun as practical arrangement had become love deeper than either had expected. Grace felt the full weight of what she stood to lose when Whitmore arrived. The third letter came in January, brought by a rider who'd traveled through dangerous winter conditions to deliver it. Grace read it alone while Jeremiah was away helping a neighbor repair storm damage. Whitmore was coming in spring. He'd secured legal documents that would give him authority to investigate irregularities in territorial marriage records. He implied that Grace's marriage could be declared invalid due to procedural errors. Grace realized she'd reached a decision point. She could flee before spring and protect the community from Whitmore's anger, or she could stay and fight for the life she'd built, knowing that her battle might destroy everything she loved. She looked around the cabin she'd transformed into a home. Through the window she could see the settlement, where she'd finally found acceptance and purpose. The choice should have been simple. But Grace had learned something about herself during these mountain months. She'd discovered that running from threats only delayed confrontation. It didn't end it. For the first time in her life, she decided to stand and fight. Grace stared at the letter until her hands stopped shaking. She couldn't carry this burden alone anymore. When Jeremiah returned that evening, she was sitting at their kitchen table with all 3 letters spread before her. "I need to tell you something that might change how you feel about our marriage." Jeremiah hung his coat by the door and joined her at the table. His expression remained calm as he read Whitmore's increasingly threatening messages. "Tell me about this man." Grace's voice was steady but quiet. "Cornelius Whitmore owns textile mills in Philadelphia. He decided he wanted me as his mistress after seeing me at a medical lecture. When I refused, he used his political connections to destroy my family's business. That's why you came west. I thought marriage would protect me. I thought distance would be enough." Grace met Jeremiah's eyes. "I should have told you the truth before our wedding. You had a right to know what you were agreeing to." Jeremiah folded the letters carefully. "You were protecting yourself from a predator. That's not something you need to apologize for." His matter-of-fact response surprised Grace. She'd expected anger, or at least resentment about the deception. "He's not just coming for me. These letters suggest he has bigger plans involving Cedar Ridge itself." Jeremiah studied the most recent letter again. "He mentions investigating territorial land grants. That doesn't sound like personal revenge." Grace pulled out a 4th letter she'd been afraid to mention. "This one arrived yesterday." The final message revealed Whitmore's true scheme. He'd invested in railroad development and wanted to purchase the entire Cedar Ridge Valley for a new rail line. Grace's presence gave him a legal excuse to come west with territorial authority to investigate land ownership irregularities. He's planning to claim that improper marriage records invalidate property transfers. If our marriage is declared illegal, he can challenge land ownership throughout the settlement. Jeremiah's jaw tightened as he understood the full scope of the threat. "He's using you as an excuse to steal everyone's land. That's why I should leave before he arrives. Without me here, he has no legal justification for his investigation. Running won't solve this. Men like Whitmore don't stop until someone stops them." Grace had expected Jeremiah to agree that her departure was the safest option. His determination to fight surprised and frightened her. "You don't understand how powerful he is. He has connections in Washington that could destroy this entire community." "Then we need to be smarter than he is." The next morning, Jeremiah walked Grace to Elena's store. They needed allies who understood the stakes and had experience fighting corrupt authority. Elena listened to their explanation with growing anger. Her own family had lost land in New Mexico to similar schemes involving forged documents and legal technicalities. "These railroad men think they can steal from anyone without consequences. They believe people like us don't know how to fight back properly." Pastor Williams joined their discussion when Elena summoned him. The minister's gentle demeanor concealed sharp intelligence about territorial law and government procedures. "I've seen these land grab schemes before. They work because isolated communities don't have access to proper legal representation." Grace felt a spark of hope. What if we had someone who understood their legal tactics? She retrieved several law books from her collection at home. During her college years, she'd studied legal procedures alongside medical training. Dr. Webb had believed doctors needed to understand the law to protect their patients from discrimination. "I spent 2 years studying territorial law. Whitmore's scheme depends on finding procedural errors in official records. Grace opened one of her texts to a chapter on marriage documentation. If our marriage records are properly filed and witnessed, he can't claim they're invalid, but we need to verify that every legal requirement was met. Pastor Williams produced the church records from their wedding ceremony. Elena and 2 shopkeepers had served as witnesses. All signatures were present and properly notarized. The marriage is completely legal, Pastor Williams confirmed. But Whitmore might try to challenge the witness's eligibility or claim the proper waiting periods weren't observed. Grace studied territorial marriage law with the same intensity she'd once applied to medical texts. She found Whitmore's likely strategies and began developing counter-arguments for each one. He'll probably claim that marriages performed without proper territorial registration are invalid. But the law clearly states that church ceremonies are legally binding as long as they're properly witnessed and recorded. Elena spread word carefully through the community about the approaching threat. She avoided creating panic while ensuring that key families understood what was at stake. The response surprised Grace. Families who'd initially viewed her with suspicion now rallied to support her. Tom Bradley, the trapper she'd saved, organized the miners to gather evidence of Whitmore's railroad connections and potentially fraudulent federal documents. Mrs. Henderson approached Grace at the general store with an unexpected offer of help. "I may not have liked you at first, but you've proven your worth to this community. That man has no right to come here and threaten what we've built." Grace realized that her medical practice and teaching had created deeper bonds than she'd understood. The community wasn't just tolerating her presence anymore. They were actively choosing to protect her. Jeremiah spent his evenings helping Grace prepare legal documents that would demonstrate the validity of their marriage and the legitimacy of local land ownership. His practical intelligence complemented her formal education perfectly. "We're going to beat him," Grace said one night as they organized their evidence. "We're going to beat him together." But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that Whitmore had resources and connections they couldn't anticipate. He'd spent months planning his approach to Cedar Ridge. Their few weeks of preparation might not be enough to counter schemes backed by railroad money and political influence. The real test would come when Whitmore arrived with whatever legal authority he'd managed to secure. Grace had learned to trust her new community, but she wondered if their support would hold against a man who'd destroyed her family's life with a few strategic conversations. Spring was coming, and with it, the confrontation that would determine whether Grace had finally found a home worth fighting for or whether some threats were too powerful to overcome with courage and community solidarity alone. Cornelius Whitmore arrived on the afternoon stagecoach with 2 well-dressed men who carried themselves like hired enforcers. The entire main street seemed to pause as the trio stepped down onto Cedar Ridge's dusty boardwalk. Whitmore was exactly as Grace remembered him, tall, immaculately groomed, with cold blue eyes that assessed everything around him like a merchant calculating profit. His expensive coat and polished boots marked him as someone accustomed to getting his way through wealth and intimidation. Grace watched from Elena's store window as Whitmore surveyed the settlement with obvious disdain. His companions flanked him protectively while he brushed dust from his sleeves with theatrical disgust. "He looks like every railroad investor I've ever seen," Elena muttered. "All polish and no substance." Whitmore's first stop was the saloon, where he began asking pointed questions about land ownership and marriage records. Word spread quickly through the settlement that an important man from back east was investigating irregularities in territorial documentation. Pastor Williams intercepted Whitmore outside the church an hour later. Grace and Jeremiah positioned themselves nearby to overhear the conversation that would reveal Whitmore's official strategy. "I understand you performed a marriage ceremony last fall between Jeremiah Cole and a woman calling herself Grace Washington." "I performed a legal marriage between 2 people who met all territorial requirements." Whitmore produced an official-looking document with territorial seals. "I'm here on behalf of the Territorial Land Office to investigate potential fraud in marriage records that could affect property ownership rights." "What kind of fraud?" "Marriages performed without proper verification of identity or legal eligibility. When such marriages are invalidated, they can void property transfers and land grants associated with the illegal unions." Pastor Williams examined Whitmore's documentation carefully. This gives you authority to review records, not to invalidate legal marriages. We'll see what my review discovers. Grace stepped forward before Jeremiah could stop her. Months of preparation had built her confidence, and she refused to hide while Whitmore threatened her community. Mr. Whitmore, his face showed genuine surprise at seeing her approach voluntarily. He'd expected to find her cowering and isolated, not standing tall with obvious community support. Grace, you've led me quite a chase across the country. You chose to follow me. I chose to build a new life. Whitmore's companions moved closer, but several townspeople had gathered nearby. Tom Bradley and 3 other miners positioned themselves within easy reach. Elena emerged from her store with her husband, who carried a shotgun casually across his arm. Your marriage to this mountain man is illegal. You were promised to me through formal arrangements with your family. Grace's voice carried clearly across the growing crowd. My family never promised me to anyone. You demanded something that was never yours to claim. I have legal documentation of our engagement agreement. Show it. Whitmore hesitated. His threats had always worked through intimidation, not actual legal proof. Grace's calm demand for evidence exposed the weakness in his position. The territorial marriage investigator will review all relevant documentation. A new voice interrupted from behind the crowd. I'm Judge Harrison Mitchell, Territorial Circuit Judge. I understand there's some question about local marriage records. Grace's heart sank. Whitmore had brought his own judge to rubber stamp whatever conclusions he wanted. The legal battle she'd prepared for was rigged from the start, but Judge Mitchell surprised everyone by requesting to see all documentation from both sides. Grace produced the carefully organized legal evidence she and Jeremiah had prepared over the winter months. The marriage was performed according to all territorial requirements: proper witnesses, waiting periods, and documentation. The ceremony is completely valid under Wyoming territorial law. Whitmore's face flushed with anger at the judge's neutral assessment. There are questions about the bride's legal eligibility due to prior commitments. What prior commitments? Financial obligations to my textile business that created a binding relationship. Grace stepped forward with documents she'd prepared for exactly this moment. I was an independent contractor who provided bookkeeping services. I was never an employee, indentured servant, or party to any personal contract. She handed Judge Mitchell copies of every business transaction between her family and Whitmore's company. The records showed purely commercial relationships with no personal agreements. Mr. Whitmore, do you have documentation of any legal commitment beyond standard business contracts? Whitmore's silence spoke louder than words. His entire scheme depended on intimidation and legal technicalities, not actual law. Judge Mitchell continued his review of Grace's marriage documents. This union appears completely legitimate. I see no grounds for invalidation. What about the railroad land grants? One of Whitmore's men demanded. What railroad land grants? The question hung in the air as Whitmore realized his companion had revealed more than intended. Grace seized the opening she'd been waiting for. Judge Mitchell, I believe Mr. Whitmore's real interest is purchasing this valley for railroad development. His marriage investigation is a pretext for challenging local land ownership. Grace produced the research she and Tom Bradley had compiled about Whitmore's railroad investments and his pattern of using legal technicalities to force land sales. Judge Mitchell studied the evidence with growing interest. Mr. Whitmore, are you representing railroad interests in this matter? My personal business investments are irrelevant to this marriage investigation. They're extremely relevant if this investigation is a pretext for challenging property rights. Grace felt the momentum shifting in their favor. Whitmore's arrogance had led him to overreach, and his own companions had exposed his true motives. The crowd of townspeople had grown larger and more vocal in their support for Grace. Pastor Williams, Elena, Tom Bradley, and even Mrs. Marie Henderson stood united against Whitmore's threats. Judge Mitchell addressed the assembled community. Based on my review, the marriage between Jeremiah Cole and Grace Washington is completely valid. I find no evidence of fraud or irregularities that would justify further investigation. Whitmore's face contorted with rage as his carefully planned scheme collapsed in front of dozens of witnesses. Grace stood quietly beside Jeremiah, feeling genuine pride for the first time in months. The legal battle was over, but Grace sensed that Whitmore's defeat had only made him more dangerous. Judge Mitchell's ruling should have ended the matter, but Whitmore's fury made him reckless. He began making loud accusations about territorial corruption and demanding federal intervention in local land disputes. His threats backfired spectacularly. Tom Bradley approached the judge with evidence he'd been saving for the right moment. The miners had discovered that Whitmore's Federal Railroad documents contained forged signatures and fabricated authorization numbers. "Judge, we found these papers in Mr. Whitmore's hotel room. They don't match any legitimate federal land grants on record with the Territorial Office." Judge Mitchell examined the documents with growing amazement. Whitmore had been carrying completely fraudulent paperwork that claimed federal authority to seize private property for railroad development. "Mr. Whitmore, these documents appear to be forgeries of Federal Land Office seals and signatures." Whitmore's face went pale as he realized his illegal schemes were being exposed in front of an official territorial judge. His companions began stepping away from him as the legal implications became clear. There must be some mistake in the documentation process. The mistake is attempting to defraud the territorial government with false federal authority. Grace watched Whitmore's empire of threats collapse around him. For months, she'd lived in fear of his power and connections. Now she saw him revealed as a common criminal whose intimidation tactics couldn't survive honest scrutiny. Judge Mitchell issued an immediate warrant for Whitmore's arrest on charges of fraud, attempted theft of federal property, and conspiracy to defraud territorial land offices. The charges carried serious federal penalties that even Whitmore's political connections couldn't easily dismiss. Whitmore's hired companions abandoned him completely when faced with potential criminal charges. They departed on the next stagecoach, leaving him isolated and defenseless for the first time in his adult life. Pastor Williams organized a community celebration that evening at the church. Grace found herself surrounded by people who'd initially viewed her with suspicion, but now treated her as a beloved family member. Mrs. Henderson approached with an unexpected apology. "I was wrong about you from the beginning. This community is stronger because of what you've brought to it." Elena embraced Grace with tears of joy. "You stood up to him. You showed everyone that bullies can be defeated when good people work together." Jeremiah watched his wife accept congratulations with quiet pride. The fearful woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach 6 months ago had transformed into a confident leader who'd rallied an entire community against injustice. That night, Grace and Jeremiah sat together on their cabin porch watching stars appear over the mountain peaks. The valley spread below them peaceful and secure, no longer threatened by Whitmore's schemes. "I never thanked you properly for staying when you could have run," Jeremiah said. "This is my home now. These people are my family. Running would have meant losing everything that matters." Grace leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling genuinely safe for the first time in years. Whitmore was facing federal prosecution that would occupy his attention for years to come. His threats had lost all power over her life. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Philadelphia that brought news Grace had been hoping for since leaving Pennsylvania. Her father wrote that Whitmore's criminal prosecution had destroyed his business reputation and political influence. The charges against him had become a public scandal that ruined his standing in Philadelphia society. More importantly, the collapse of Whitmore's enterprises had created opportunities for her family to rebuild their bakery. Without his interference, they'd secured a loan and reopened their shop in a neighborhood that welcomed their business. Grace shared the letter with Jeremiah over breakfast. "My father wants to visit this summer. He says the whole family is curious about the mountain man who married their daughter. Think they'll approve of your choice? I think they'll love you as much as I do." Spring brought visible changes to Cedar Ridge. Grace's medical practice had attracted new families to the settlement, drawn by the security of having skilled healthcare available. Her teaching program expanded to include advanced mathematics and basic legal principles for older students. The railroad development that Whitmore had tried to force illegally eventually came to the valley through legitimate channels. The territorial government negotiated fair compensation for land purchases and brought economic opportunities that benefited everyone. Elena's general store expanded into a proper trading post. Pastor Williams built a larger church to accommodate the growing congregation. Tom Bradley and several other miners discovered a silver deposit that brought prosperity to the entire community. By autumn, Grace's transformation was complete in ways that went beyond her personal happiness. She'd become the unofficial leader of Cedar Ridge's civic improvements, organizing everything from road construction to establishing a proper school building. One October morning, Grace woke to find Jeremiah building a crib in their bedroom. She'd confirmed her pregnancy the week before, but seeing the physical preparations made the coming baby feel real for the first time. Boy or girl, this child will grow up in a place where intelligence is valued over prejudice, Grace said, running her hands over the smooth wood. And where community matters more than individual power. That afternoon brought a letter that completed Grace's journey from refugee to community leader. The Territorial Medical Board officially recognized her qualifications and authorized her to practice medicine throughout Wyoming Territory. She was the first African-American woman to receive such recognition in the region. Grace shared the news with Elena and Pastor Williams during her weekly rounds. The official recognition meant she could expand her practice to serve mining camps and settlements throughout the territory. "You've made history," Elena said with obvious pride. "We've made history. None of this would have been possible without this community's support." Winter arrived early that year, but Grace faced it with confidence born from experience. She and Jeremiah had prepared thoroughly, their cabin now a warm and welcoming home filled with books, medical supplies, and the quiet contentment of two people who'd found their place in the world. On Christmas morning, Grace received a package from her family in Philadelphia. Inside was a hand-knitted baby blanket and a letter announcing that her parents had sold their rebuilt bakery and were moving to Cedar Ridge permanently. Grace smiled as she imagined her parents' faces when they saw the thriving community their daughter had helped build. She'd come west expecting only survival and dignity. She'd found love, purpose, and a home where her intelligence was celebrated rather than feared. The mountain man who'd expected a loveless marriage had discovered that sometimes the greatest transformations came from the most unexpected partnerships.